On February 11, 2014, Jean Butler called her younger sister from a gas station payphone in Talkeetna, Alaska, population 876. The call lasted 4 minutes. She told her sister Colleen that the northern lights had been out every night for a week, that the cold was a living thing up here, something with teeth, and that she'd finally found a place where her thoughts didn't echo. Colleen asked her when she was coming home. "I don't think I am," Jean said. Not angry, not dramatic, just factual, like she was describing the weather. That was the last time anyone in Jean Butler's family heard her voice. 3 years later, in January of 2017, a wildlife surveyor named Arne Skarsgård was conducting a wolverine population count in a remote stretch of the Susitna Valley, roughly 40 miles from the nearest maintained road. He was on snowshoes, working a grid pattern through black spruce forest, when he noticed something that didn't belong, a thin, vertical line interrupting the tree cover, too straight to be natural. He adjusted his route. The cabin was small, maybe 12 by 14 feet, set into a clearing that had been deliberately cut. Firewood was stacked against one wall, frozen solid and covered in snow, but stacked with care, the kind of attention that speaks to long-term habitation, not passing use. A 5-gallon bucket sat near the door, inverted, serving as a step. Arne approached with caution. In the Alaskan interior, remote cabins can belong to anyone. Trappers, prospectors, people who've come to the woods to be left alone and will enforce that preference with a rifle. He called out. No answer. He knocked. Nothing. The door wasn't locked. Welcome back to another video on my channel. To protect the victims, the names and places in this story have been slightly changed. If you have a story of your own to share, make sure to do so using the link down below. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. In that part of Alaska, you don't lock a cabin. Someone might need shelter to survive the night, and a locked door in January is a death sentence. He pushed it open. The cold inside was the same as the cold outside. That told him everything before his eyes adjusted to the dark. No one had kept a fire here in a long time. She was on the bed, under layers of wool blankets and animal hides. Her body was frozen, preserved by the climate that had ultimately killed her. Her knees were drawn up slightly, not in a posture of distress but of sleep, someone curling against the cold, pulling the blankets tighter, drifting off. On the floor beside the bed, within arm's reach, was a journal. Composition notebook, black and white marbled cover, the kind you can buy at any drugstore for $2. It was frozen open to its last entry. Arne didn't read it. He backed out of the cabin, closed the door carefully, and spent 3 hours on snowshoes reaching a point where his satellite phone could get a signal. "I found someone," he told the Alaska State Troopers dispatcher. "A woman. She's been dead a while, maybe a long while." He paused. "She has a notebook. I think she wrote down what happened to her." He was wrong about that, as it turned out. Jean Butler hadn't written down what happened to her. She'd written down what she'd chosen. And the difference between those two things is the reason this story has never left the people who encountered it. Jean Eloise Butler was born on March 3, 1982, in Duluth, Minnesota, the second of 3 daughters born to Ronald and Marjorie Butler. Ron was a machinist at a paper mill. Marjorie worked the front desk at a veterinary clinic. They were practical people, meat and potatoes, Lutheran church on Sundays, snowmobile in the garage, mortgage paid on time. The kind of family that doesn't make the news. Jean was the middle child, and she inhabited that position with a specificity that anyone with siblings would recognize. Colleen, 2 years older, was the responsible one. Straight A's, student council, college applications submitted early. Danielle, 4 years younger, was the baby. Indulged, loud, the family performer. Jean existed in the space between those two identities, not quite either, still figuring out what was hers. She was quiet in a way that people often misread. Not shy. She'd talk to anyone, strike up conversations at gas stations, befriend strangers in grocery store lines. But there was a layer underneath the sociability that stayed private. Colleen described it years later as a kind of glass wall. "You could see Jean," Colleen said. "You could talk to her, laugh with her, spend a whole day with her and feel like you were close. But there was always something she kept, some room she didn't let you into. I don't think she was hiding anything bad. I think she just needed a part of herself that belonged to nobody else." Jean's hands were always busy. She knitted, sewed, built things. At 14, she built a bookshelf from scrap lumber, and it was ugly. Colleen remembered this clearly. Lopsided, the stain uneven, one shelf already bowing under the weight of paperbacks. But Jean loved it with a ferocity that surprised everyone. She'd built it. It existed because she'd made it exist. That seemed to matter to her in a way she couldn't articulate. She had a voice that carried, low for a woman, with a rasp in it that made people lean in. She sang in the car, badly, enthusiastically, all the words wrong. She drank her coffee black and took it personally when people added sugar to theirs. She read constantly, not literature, but field guides, survival manuals, books about weather patterns and animal tracking and how to build structures from available materials. Most girls her age were reading Cosmo, her father said. Jean was reading the Army Corps of Engineers manual on cold weather shelter construction. I didn't know what to make of it. I still don't. She graduated from high school in 2000, middle of her class, and enrolled at the University of Minnesota Duluth to study environmental science. She lasted 3 semesters. The classrooms bothered her, not the material, but the containment, the fluorescent lights, the rows of chairs, the way knowledge was parceled into 50-minute blocks and then interrupted by a bell, as if understanding operated on a schedule. She told Colleen she felt like a dog at the end of a chain, running the same circle until the grass was dead. "What do you want?" Colleen asked. "I want to be cold," Jean said. "Really cold. I want to be somewhere where if I make a mistake, it matters." Colleen thought she was being dramatic. Jean was 20 years old, and 20-year-olds say things like that, grand, romantic, untested. But Jean meant it. She'd meant every word. She dropped out in the spring of 2002, worked a series of jobs over the next several years, all of them outdoors, all of them physical. She guided canoe trips in the Boundary Waters. She worked a season on a trail crew in Montana's Glacier National Park. She spent a winter as a caretaker at a remote research station near Ely, Minnesota. Her only company a radio, a wood stove, and a rotating cast of pine martens that lived under the porch. "That was the happiest I ever heard her," Colleen said. She'd call from the station once a week and she sounded settled, like she'd stopped looking for something. But then the season ended, and she had to come back, and you could hear it, the walls closing in again. Jean was not mentally ill. This distinction matters because the story that follows will tempt people toward that explanation, and it doesn't fit. She was evaluated twice during her 20s, once at Marjorie's insistence, once voluntarily, and both times the assessment was the same. No clinical depression, no psychosis, no diagnosable disorder. She was, by every measurable standard, a mentally healthy woman who simply wanted to live in a way that modern American life didn't easily accommodate. She wasn't running from something, the second psychologist wrote in her notes. She was running toward something. The distinction is clinically significant. By 2010, Jean was 28 and working at an outfitter in Ely, selling gear to tourists headed into the Boundary Waters. She was good at the job, knowledgeable, patient with beginners, honest about what people needed versus what the store wanted to sell them. Her boss, a man named Garland Thorson, said she could have managed the place if she'd wanted to. "But you could tell," Garland said. "Every time she sold somebody a tent and a topo map, she wanted to be the one walking into the woods, not the one handing over the supplies. It was like asking a horse to sell saddles." In her off hours, Jean was teaching herself. She'd accumulated knowledge the way some people accumulate debt, steadily, almost invisibly, until the total was staggering. She could identify 200 species of boreal plants. She could build a fire in wind and rain with a single match. She could trap, skin, and tan a rabbit hide. She could read weather and cloud formations with more accuracy than most smartphone apps. She was also reading, voraciously, about Alaska. Not the tourist Alaska of cruise ships and gift shops, but the interior, the vast, indifferent, roadless wilderness that begins where the highways end and stretches north to the Brooks Range and beyond. She read accounts of homesteaders, trappers, bush pilots. She read about people who had gone into that landscape and thrived, and people who had gone in and died. And she seemed to study both outcomes with equal fascination. She had a map on her wall, Colleen remembered. Alaska. She'd marked spots with pushpins, red ones for places people had lived successfully, blue ones for places people had died. There were a lot of blue ones. I asked her if the blue ones scared her. Jean had shrugged. They're honest, she said. The land doesn't pretend. In the fall of 2013, Jean Butler quit her job at the outfitter, sold most of her possessions, and bought a one-way ticket to Anchorage. She was 31 years old. She had $11,000 in savings, a truck she'd purchased from a classified ad in the Anchorage Daily News, and a plan she'd been refining for 3 years. She was going to build a cabin in the Alaskan wilderness and live there. Not for a season, not as an experiment, not as a sabbatical from real life. Permanently. She was going to do what people had been doing in that landscape for thousands of years, inhabited on its own terms, with her own hands, answerable to nothing but weather and daylight and the fundamental question of whether she could keep herself alive. Her family's reaction was what you'd expect. Ronald Butler, her father, asked her to be reasonable. Marjorie cried. Danielle, the youngest sister, said Jean was being selfish, that she was abandoning people who loved her to live some fantasy. Jean listened to all of it. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just waited until everyone had finished, and then she said something that Colleen would later repeat to investigators, to journalists, to anyone who asked about her sister. I know you think I'm trying to die, June said. I'm not. I'm trying to live. They just look the same from the outside. Jean spent the winter of 2013 to 2014 in Talkeetna, a small town at the base of Denali, preparing. She rented a room above a bar called the Fairview Inn, worked part-time at a hardware store, and spent every free hour acquiring the materials and knowledge she'd need. Talkeetna is a particular kind of Alaska town, part tourist stop, part bush community, populated by climbers, pilots, artists, drunks, and people who've come to the end of the American road system and decided to stay. It's the kind of place where a woman buying 50 pounds of rice, a crosscut saw, and a book on log cabin construction doesn't raise eyebrows. Jean made a few acquaintances there. Not friends. She was careful about that distinction. She was friendly but impermanent, and people sensed it. She was passing through, gathering what she needed, and would soon be gone. Lowell Beckham owned the hardware store. He was 67, a retired bush pilot with a prosthetic left hand, lost to a propeller accident in 1991, and the particular brand of pragmatic respect for competence that defines rural Alaska. He watched Jean study materials, ask detailed questions about load-bearing capacity and insulation values, and snow load calculations, and he recognized something. She wasn't playing, Lowell said later. I've seen 100 people come through here with some idea about living off the grid. They buy an axe and a tarp and they're back in Anchorage in 2 weeks, frostbitten and crying. Jean was different. She'd done the math. She knew what she was getting into. He paused. That's what scares me, looking back. She knew exactly what she was getting into. In January of 2014, June purchased 200 pounds of dry goods: rice, beans, flour, oats, powdered milk, salt, sugar, coffee. She bought traps, snare wire, fishing line, ammunition for a .30-06 rifle she'd purchased in Anchorage. She bought hand tools, a froe, a draw knife, a brace and bit, chisels. She bought a wood stove, disassembled, that weighed 80 pounds in pieces. She made multiple trips into the bush by snow machine, hauling supplies on a sled to a location she'd scouted the previous fall. She told Lowell she'd found a spot in the Susitna Valley on a south-facing slope near a creek, sheltered from the worst wind but with enough clearing for light. I asked her how far from the road, Lowell said. She told me 40 miles. I asked how far from the nearest neighbor. She said she didn't know and didn't want to. On February 11th, Jean made the phone call to Colleen from the gas station payphone, the call where she said she wasn't coming home. Then she drove her truck to a trailhead, parked it in a pullout that would be buried in snow within days, loaded her snow machine, and headed into the Susitna Valley. No one reported her missing for 5 weeks. The delay was partly by design, partly by family dynamics. Jean had told her family she was living in Talkeetna, working, taking her time. She'd said she'd be in touch when she could, but that phone access was limited. She'd laid groundwork for silence. Marjorie called the Fairview Inn in mid-March when she hadn't heard from Jean in over a month. The bartender said Jean had checked out in early February. He didn't know where she'd gone. People leave Talkeetna all the time. south to Anchorage, north to Fairbanks, or into the bush, where gone means something different than it does in the lower 48. Marjorie called the hardware store next. Lowell told her what he knew, that Jean had been preparing for a wilderness stay, that she'd hauled supplies into the bush, that she seemed to know what she was doing. I tried to reassure her, Lowell said. I told her Jean was capable, prepared, serious. I said she'd probably come out when breakup hit and the snow melted. Marjorie wasn't reassured. She called the Alaska State Troopers. Trooper Darrell Yupik, no relation to the indigenous people of the same name, a coincidence he'd long stopped explaining, took the initial report. He was 41, stationed in Palmer, and had worked missing persons cases in Bush, Alaska for 9 years. He knew the taxonomy of disappearance up here. There were people who got lost, people who got hurt, people who fell through ice or off cliffs or into rivers, people who were taken by bears or by cold or by their own despair. And then there were people who simply went into the woods because they wanted to and didn't want to be found. The family described a competent, prepared adult who had communicated her intentions, Trooper Yupik wrote in his initial assessment. No evidence of mental health crisis, criminal involvement, or foul play. Subject appears to have voluntarily entered the wilderness with adequate supplies and skills. Classification: voluntary missing adult. This classification matters. In Alaska, adults have the right to disappear. If there's no evidence of crime or mental health emergency, the troopers can't mount a search for someone who doesn't want to be found. They can note the report, keep the file open, and wait. I understand that's hard for families, Yupik said. They want helicopters and search teams and someone to bring their person home. But if a grown woman with no criminal record and no psychiatric history decides to live in the bush, that's her right. It's Alaska. Half the state is people who came here to be left alone. He made inquiries anyway, checked hospitals, morgues, and prior arrest records. He contacted the Talkeetna community and asked around. Nobody had seen Joan since February. Nobody had any concerns beyond the obvious. Marjorie called every week. Colleen called every 2 weeks. They were told the same thing each time. No new information, no evidence of distress, no basis for a search. I asked him what would make them search, Colleen said. He told me if they found her truck with blood in it, or if someone reported hearing gunshots, or if she turned up at a hospital. Short of that, she was an adult exercising her freedom. Freedom, Colleen repeated, her voice flat. That's what they called it. Spring came. The snow melted. Jean didn't emerge. Summer came. The days stretched to 20 hours of light. Jean didn't call. Fall came. The first snow fell in September. No word. Colleen flew to Alaska in October of 2014, 8 months after Jean's disappearance. She spent 2 weeks in Talkeetna, talking to everyone she could find. She went to the hardware store and Lowell showed her what Jean had purchased, the manifest of tools and supplies that read like a woman building a life, not ending one. She drove to the trailhead where Jean's truck had been parked. The truck was gone, towed months earlier by the borough, impounded, eventually auctioned when no one claimed it. She stood at the trailhead and looked into the wilderness, spruce and birch stretching to the horizon, mountains beyond, the Susitna River Valley, vast and indifferent, a landscape that could hold 1,000 cabins and show no sign of any of them. I yelled her name, Colleen said. I don't know why. The trees were so thick you couldn't see 20 feet. I yelled her name and my voice just went in. The woods swallowed it, didn't even give me an echo. She went home. There was nothing else she could do. The years passed the way they pass for families of the missing, suspended, recursive, organized around an absence. Holidays had a chair that stayed empty. Conversations circled back to the same unanswerable questions. Marjorie kept Jean's childhood bedroom intact, as if her 31-year-old daughter might walk in and need it. Ronald Butler didn't talk about John. This wasn't denial. It was a particular kind of male grief that expresses itself as silence, as projects completed in the garage, as early bedtimes. He built a deck that summer. He built a shed in the fall. He was building things his daughter would have understood, the satisfaction of making something exist with your hands, though he never articulated the connection and probably wasn't conscious of it. Danielle, the youngest, was angry. Anger is grief's bodyguard, and Danielle wore it like armor. She was angry at Jean for leaving. Angry at the troopers for not searching, angry at Lowell Beckham for selling her sister the supplies, angry at Alaska itself, the whole vast selfish state, for being the kind of place where a person could vanish and the official response was to shrug and call it freedom. She didn't ask to disappear, Danielle told a reporter years later. She asked to live differently. Those aren't the same thing, and nobody up there could tell the difference. Colleen existed in a harder space. She was the one Jean had called. She was the one who'd heard her sister's voice say, "I don't think I am," when asked about coming home. She played that sentence over and over, listening for something she'd missed. A tremor, a hesitation, a coded plea for help. She never found one. Jean had sounded certain. That was the worst part. If she'd sounded scared or sad or confused, I could have fought harder, Colleen said. I could have called someone, gotten a welfare check, something. But she sounded like herself. She sounded like Jean. She sounded like someone who'd finally found what she was looking for. Colleen paused. How do you rescue someone from what they want? In January of 2017, Arne Skarsgård found the cabin. The Alaska State Troopers dispatched a team by helicopter, Trooper Yupik among them, though he'd transferred to a different unit by then. He remembered the name immediately. Butler, he said when he got the call. Gene Butler, the one from Minnesota. The helicopter landed in a clearing a quarter mile from the cabin. The team approached on snowshoes, 4 men in a line through birch and spruce forest, their breath crystallizing in air that was 31 below zero. The snow was thigh-deep in places. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that isn't just absence of sound, but feels active, intentional, as if the landscape is listening. The cabin was exactly as Arne had described it. Small, well-built, set into the south-facing slope with the precision of someone who understood winter light and wind patterns. The logs were peeled and notched with care, not perfect, not professional, but competent. The roof was sawed over poles, collapsed in one corner under the weight of accumulated snow, but otherwise intact. Trooper Yupik noted the details as he approached. Firewood stacked to the eaves, most of it cut to uniform length. A cache pole, a horizontal log suspended between 2 trees, out of reach of bears, hung with what had once been game, now frozen and largely consumed by scavengers. A small clearing to the south that had been a garden, the soil dark and turned, the raised beds defined by peeled logs. She'd been living here, Yupik wrote, not surviving, living. There's a difference. The garden, the firewood, the cache. This was a homestead. She'd built a homestead. He opened the door. The interior was organized with a precision that Yupik found difficult to reconcile with the fact of the body on the bed. A wood stove, properly installed with a stovepipe venting through the roof. A plywood shelf holding jars of preserved food, berries, fish, what appeared to be moose meat. A set of hand tools hung on the wall, each outlined in pencil so it could be returned to its exact place. A water bucket, empty, frozen. A kerosene lamp, a small stack of books, field guides mostly, their spines cracked from use, and the bed, and Jean. She was lying on her right side, knees drawn up, blankets pulled to her chin. Her face was turned toward the wall. Her hair, long and dark, was spread across the pillow, a pillow she'd made herself, stuffed with spruce boughs, the cover sewn from canvas. She looked like she was sleeping. That's what everyone who entered the cabin said, independently, without hearing the others say it. She looked like she was sleeping and the fire had gone out while she slept. The journal was on the floor, open, a pencil beside it, within arm's reach, as if she'd been writing and set it down and closed her eyes. Yupik crouched beside it and read the last entry. He read it twice. Then he stood up and went outside and stood in the snow for several minutes, saying nothing. One of the other troopers followed him out. "What does it say?" Yupik didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was careful, controlled, the voice of a professional managing information. "We need to bag that journal as evidence," he said. "And we need to call the medical examiner. And then we need to call Minnesota." "What does it say, Daryl?" Yupik looked at the trees, the sky, the snow, the silence of the Susitna Valley pressing in from every side. "It says a lot of things," he said. 3 years of things. The journal was transported to the state crime lab in Anchorage. The medical examiner, Dr. Priya Nagarajan, performed the autopsy after the body was carefully thawed over a period of 72 hours. The forensic team cataloged every item in the cabin, photographed every surface, documented a life that had been lived with extraordinary intention in extraordinary isolation. The cause of death, when it came, was not dramatic. It carried no violence, no malice, no human hand other than Jun's own. But it was not simple either, and the story it told, combined with the journal, was the kind of story that refuses to stay in the category you assign it. Dr. Nagarajan estimated Jun had died in late November or early December of 2016, approximately 6 to 8 weeks before Arne Skarsgård found the cabin. The cause was hypothermia, complicated by malnutrition, and what the report described as general systemic decline consistent with prolonged caloric deficit. In simpler terms, Jean Butler had been slowly starving. Not suddenly, not from a single catastrophic event, but gradually, across months as her food stores dwindled and the demands of surviving an Alaskan winter outpaced her ability to replenish them. Her body consumed itself, fat first, then muscle, until there wasn't enough fuel to keep her core temperature stable. On a night in late November, the fire in her wood stove went out, and her body couldn't compensate. She died in her sleep. The cold took her gently, the way cold takes people when they're already depleted. The body stops shivering, the mind drifts. The sleep deepens until it becomes something else. The question that would haunt Trooper Yupik, Dr. Nagarajan, Jean's family, and anyone who read the journal was whether Jean understood what was happening, whether she knew in those final weeks and days that she was dying. The journal answered that question. The journal answered it clearly. She knew. Colleen Butler received the call on a Tuesday afternoon in January. She was at work. She managed an insurance office in Duluth, a job of fluorescent lights and 50-minute blocks, the kind of contained existence her sister had fled. The trooper on the phone was gentle, professional, and brief. They'd found Jean. She was deceased. She'd been deceased for some time. She'd been living in a cabin she'd built herself. She'd left a journal. Colleen sat at her desk for a long time after the call ended. Her coworkers noticed something was wrong. Her face had changed, gone somewhere else. But she waved them away. She needed a minute. She needed more than a minute, but a minute was what she could ask for in an insurance office on a Tuesday afternoon. She called Marjorie. She called Ronald. She called Danielle. Each call was its own particular devastation, the same information landing differently on different hearts. Marjorie made a sound Colleen had never heard a person make. Ronald said okay 3 times and then hung up. Danielle said nothing. Silence from the angriest person Colleen knew. That was the one that scared her most. Then Colleen drove to the shore of Lake Superior and sat in her car in a parking lot and watched the ice. It was January in Duluth, and the lake was frozen near the shore, vast gray plates of ice shifting and groaning with a sound that carries for miles. Cold. Genuinely, dangerously cold, the kind of cold that June had described as a living thing with teeth. Colleen sat there until dark. She wasn't making a decision or processing or doing any of the things people say you do at moments like this. She was trying to feel what her sister had felt. The cold pressing against the car windows, the scale of the landscape. The way, if you let it, the frozen world could feel not hostile but honest. A place that didn't pretend, that didn't soften its edges, that asked you directly and without sentiment whether you could endure. I think I understood her for about 5 minutes, Colleen said later. Sitting there in my car, watching the ice, I understood why she went. Not the whole thing. I'll never understand the whole thing. But for 5 minutes, I felt what she felt. That the cold was real in a way that nothing else was. Then she drove home, because she had a family and a job and a life built on the assumption that shelter and warmth are not optional, and she couldn't afford to sit in a parking lot understanding her dead sister for longer than 5 minutes. The journal was 217 pages. John had written in it nearly every day for 3 years, from the week she arrived at the cabin site in February of 2014 until the final entry in late November of 2016. The handwriting was small, disciplined, practical. No flourishes, no ornamentation, like the cabin itself. The troopers released excerpts to the family and later, with the family's consent, to the public. Reading them in sequence is an experience that resists easy categorization. It is not a suicide note. It is not a cry for help. It is not the manifesto of someone who hated civilization. It is something more complicated and more unsettling than any of those things. It is the record of a woman who chose a life, lived it fully, and understood its cost, including the final one. The first entry was dated February 14, 2014, 3 days after the phone call to Colleen. Arrived at the site, snow to my waist. Took 4 hours to dig down to the ground where the cabin will go. Hands numb even through 2 pairs of gloves. Set up the tent, got the stove going. Temperature tonight may be 30 below. The stars are so close, I feel like I could cut myself on them. I am happier than I have ever been. I want to remember this feeling because I know it won't last. Happiness never does. That's not what it's for. But right now, in this tent, with this cold, with nothing between me and the sky but nylon and my own determination, I am exactly where I belong. Tomorrow I start cutting logs. She built the cabin in 6 weeks. The journal documents every day of the construction, the trees she selected and why, the tools she used, the mistakes she made and corrected. She wrote about these things with the focused attention of someone who understood that the details were the point, that the process of building was not a means to an end, but the end itself. Beautiful. Day 12. Started notching the 5th round of logs. My saddle notches are getting better. The first ones were sloppy, too wide, daylight showing through. I've been packing the gaps with moss, but that's a temporary fix. The new ones fit tight. You can't see light through them. There's a satisfaction in that I can't explain to anyone who hasn't done it. The log sits where it should. The walls rise. The thing becomes real. My back hurts. My hands are cracked and bleeding. I burned my left thumb on the stove this morning, and it's blistered, and I keep bumping it and swearing. The saw is getting dull, and I need to file it. I'm not complaining. I'm documenting. There's a difference. She wrote about animals with the observational precision of a field biologist. She tracked the movements of a red fox that denned near the cabin and described its hunting patterns across multiple entries with such detail that a wildlife biologist who later read the journal said she'd produced publishable observations. The fox came again this morning. She sat on the woodpile, my woodpile, and watched me work like she was supervising. She has a scar on her left ear, a notch taken out of it, and one eye that's slightly lighter than the other. I've named her Lucille because she looks like a Lucille. Elegant but scrappy, the kind of woman who'd drink whiskey and tell you exactly what she thought of you. Lucille does not think much of my carpentry. She watched me drop a log on my foot and I swear she was laughing. She wrote about weather the way other people write about relationships, with intimacy, attention, and emotional complexity. A storm coming from the west. I can feel it in my joints, in the way the air gets heavy and the birds go quiet. The barometric pressure drops and the world holds its breath. I've learned to read storms the way I used to read people's faces, the approach, the hesitation, the commitment. Some storms threaten and pass. Some come in quiet and stay for days. Some hit so fast you barely have time to get inside. Today's storm is the quiet kind. It will snow for 3 days. I have enough wood. I have enough food. I will sit by the stove and listen to the wind try to get in and know that it can't, because I built these walls and they hold. That's the whole thing, isn't it? Building something that holds. The journal's first year is the year of abundance. John hunted moose successfully in the fall of 2014, a young bull, which she field dressed and processed over the course of a week, preserving the meat by smoking and freezing. She caught grayling and trout in the creek below the cabin. She gathered berries, blueberries, cranberries, crowberries, and preserved them in jars she'd brought with her supplies. She was eating well. She was working hard. She was, by every account the journal provides, thriving. September 20th, 2014. Finished processing the moose. 200 pounds of meat, more or less. Enough to see me through winter if I'm careful, and I'm careful. I sat outside tonight and watched the aurora. Green and white, rippling like curtains in a window nobody's opened in a long time. The spruce trees were black against the light. The creek was starting to freeze at the edges. I could hear it cracking and settling, like the water was talking in its sleep. Colleen would love this. Mama would love this. Even Danielle, though she'd complain about the cold. I miss them. I'm not going to pretend I don't. I miss Colleen's laugh and Mama's pot roast and even Danielle's drama. I miss Daddy's hands, how they were always nicked up from work, how he smells like machine oil and coffee. But missing them and wanting to go back are different things. I can miss them and still know I'm where I should be. The missing is just the cost. Everything costs something. The second year, 2015, was harder. The journal shows it gradually, not a catastrophe, but an accumulation of small difficulties. A stretch of wet weather in early summer that compromised her berry harvest. A hunting season in which she took a smaller animal, less meat. A tooth that ached persistently and then, in December, cracked. Leaving her in intermittent pain, she managed with willow bark tea and determination. The tooth is bad. I know it's bad. In Duluth, I'd go to a dentist and they'd fix it in an hour. Out here, I pack it with clove oil and get on with it. This is the part they don't tell you in the books about wilderness living. They talk about building cabins and trapping fur and reading the land. They don't talk about a cracked molar at 3 in the morning when the fire's gone low and your jaw feels like someone's driving a nail into it and the nearest help is 40 miles of unbroken forest away. I could leave. I could snowshoe out and find the road and flag down a truck and be in a warm dental office by tomorrow afternoon. I don't want to leave. I want this tooth to stop hurting. But I don't want to leave. These are different things. By the third year, 2016, the entries began to change. Not in quality. Jean's writing remained sharp, observant, engaged with the world around her, but in frequency. The daily entries became every other day, then every few days. She wrote about fatigue, a bone-deep tiredness that didn't resolve with sleep. She wrote about the diminishing food stores with the clinical detachment of someone assessing a situation, not someone panicking. June 4th, 2016, inventory. Rice, maybe 20 pounds. Beans, 12 pounds. Flour, gone. Salt, adequate. Coffee, almost gone, and that's the one that hurts. Moose, none in the valley this spring. I've seen tracks, but they're passing through, not staying. The hunting will be hard in fall, if there's anything to hunt. Fish, the creek is running, but the grayling are smaller this year. I don't know why. Maybe I've been taking too many. Maybe the run is shifting. I catch 2 or 3 a day, enough for a meal, not enough to store. Berries won't come until August. I am not in immediate danger, but I'm in long-term danger, and I know the difference. The food is running out. Not today, not this week, but this year. This food is running out this year. I have a choice to make. I've known it was coming for a while. That entry, I have a choice to make, is the fulcrum of the journal. Everything before it points toward it. Everything after it flows from it. And the choice Jean Butler made, documented in the pages that followed, is the reason this story has never settled into a comfortable shape, has never allowed the people who know it to file it away with a label and a lesson and move on. Because Jean Butler chose to stay. She chose to stay knowing what staying meant, and the journal, all 217 pages of it, is the record of a woman explaining, to herself and to whoever might eventually find her words, exactly why. The pages that followed that June entry are the hardest to read, not because they're despairing, not because they're confused, but because they're clear, luminously, terribly clear. And they begin with a line that Trooper Yupik read twice in the frozen cabin before he went outside and stood in the snow and couldn't speak. I would rather die here, in this place I built, in this life I chose, than live another 50 years in a world that never felt like mine. She meant it. She had always meant every word. And the pages that followed would prove it.